Do you know how incredible the human heart is? It's it's phenomenal. And I am so excited because we get to talk a little bit about the anatomy of the heart today. Now, you will see I have this 3D model of the heart here. I am currently on a website called anatomytool.org. This is a completely free resource that you can access to aid in your studying. So I really like it and wanted to use it to show you guys through some of these structures of the heart as a visual aid in our discussion today. What's really cool about this is that you can see it as a 3D model, so you could turn it all around. And as we go through the different structures, we are able to click on the numbers. It'll tell you what that structure is. So it is a very, very useful tool to have as you are studying anatomy. All right, so as we are looking at the heart here, first and foremost, we need to appreciate the fact that there are going to be four main chambers within the heart. And two of these chambers are called atria. The atria are going to be receiving chambers of the heart. So they are going to be receiving blood either from the body, so it's going to be entering into the atrium, specifically the right atrium, by certain veins that we'll discuss, like the inferior vena cava, the superior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. And then the other atria, the left atria, will be receiving blood from the lungs. So that is what we need to know first. The atria receive. Now, the other two chambers, they are called the ventricles. So the ventricles are the pumping chambers of the heart. So if you've never taken an anatomy course before, or if you ask just a random person that you see throughout your day that's never taken an anatomy course before, and you ask them, what's the point of having a heart? What does the human heart do? Most people will say, well, the heart pumps blood. Well, specifically, the ventricles are the chambers that are going to be pumping the blood. Now, depending on if we're talking about the right ventricle or the left ventricle, those ventricles will be pumping to different locations. So let's zoom out for a second and talk about the right side of the heart versus the left side of the heart. So we can see in this image here, this is the right side of the heart, and over here, this is the left side of the heart. Okay, we can see how the apex of the heart, which is this kind of point of the heart, is going to be deviated towards the left. So if you put your hand over your heart, if you're from the United States during the playing of the national anthem, you know that you put your right hand over the left side of your chest. Your heart is slightly deviated towards the left, slightly deviated left of that mid-sternal line. So we know that this is the left side of the heart, this is the right side of the heart. Now, the right side of the heart is going to be dealing with deoxygenated blood. So if we go back to what I introduced a few minutes ago or a few seconds ago in regards to the receiving versus the pumping chambers, we have a right atria, which is labeled number 5 here, and then we have the right ventricle. Okay, so those are the two chambers making up the right side of the heart. So if we go back to this right atrium, we know it's a receiving chamber. So where is the right atrium receiving blood from? Well, from a zoomed out view, the right atrium is receiving deoxygenated blood from all of the body tissues. Okay, so once the body tissues, so when the tissues utilize oxygenated blood, it becomes deoxygenated and it needs to be returned to the right atrium of the heart. So ultimately, all that deoxygenated blood is collected within various veins on their way back towards the heart, and those veins are going to merge into one of 3 structures. So we can see label number 10 here. This is called the superior vena cava. Here it's labeled the superior caval vein, but most commonly in most anatomy textbooks, that will be referred to as the superior vena cava. So all of the deoxygenated blood from the upper extremities and from the head and the neck area will be collected and merge into the superior vena cava, which dumps that deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. So, unsurprisingly, if we look at that name, superior vena cava, we also have an inferior vena cava, which we can see labeled down there. So the inferior vena cava is going to be collecting the deoxygenated blood from all of the veins that collected that blood from the lower extremities and from portions of the digestive tract. So everything that's from the inferior portion of the body. So the inferior vena cava, just like the superior vena cava, will dump that deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. Now, there is one additional structure that is going to move or dump deoxygenated blood into that right atrium, and it is called the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus is essentially collecting all of the deoxygenated blood that was supplied to the heart muscle, the heart tissue itself. So the heart is a living organ. So the muscular components of the heart, which we'll talk about in another video, the muscular components and the living cells that make up the heart in general all require oxygen in and of themselves. So there's going to be deoxygenated blood that comes from the heart tissue itself, which is collected by various veins that ultimately merge into the coronary sinus, which also dumps into this right atrium. So to summarize, what are the three structures that are going to be dumping deoxygenated blood into this right atrium? Well, it's going to be the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. From here, we can see that the right atrium collects that deoxygenated blood, and it is going to need to travel into this right ventricle. Now notice that we can see there is a valve in here. At the making of this model, we can see that this valve is open. So for the purposes of what we're talking about right now, let's say that that deoxygenated blood is moving into this right ventricle. Now, this valve we need to name. This valve is called the tricuspid valve. Notice tri because it has three flaps. Now, the tricuspid valve, its purpose after the blood, deoxygenated blood, moves from that receiving chamber, the right atria, into the right ventricle, it is important that that blood doesn't ever go back to that right atrium. So what's going to happen is that this tricuspid valve can close to ensure that there is no backflow of that deoxygenated blood once it reaches the ventricles. Very, very important, and very important to the physiology of the heart as well, because as we will discuss in a future video, a very key portion of how the ventricles are able to actually pump the blood effectively is that this ventricular chamber has to be sealed off completely so that the pressure can build and build enough pressure in order to push that blood where it needs to go. For the purposes of what we're talking with this basic anatomy in this video, what I need you to understand is that the tricuspid valve is found between the right atrium and the right ventricle, and it is going to be preventing backflow of deoxygenated blood specifically. Now, an easy memory tip for remembering the tricuspid valve is on the right side of the heart, because we're going to talk about another valve on the left side of the heart, so it can be easy to get them confused. Tricuspid valve, you're going to remember that second letter of tri is an R. Tricuspid right. Tricuspid right side of the heart. So you got that. All right. So we have deoxygenated blood that is in the right ventricle. Where's it going to go? Let's think about this for a second. If the blood in the right ventricle is deoxygenated, where could it go to become oxygenated? Well, the lungs. So the location where the right ventricle is going to need to pump the blood is to the lungs. So we need to name and be able to recognize the vessels that it's going to flow through in order to get to the lungs. Okay, so let's talk about that here next. So what we're going to see, a couple of things. We're going to see a valve here. This valve is called the pulmonary semilunar valve. It is a valve that is going to lead into this vessel. That's label number 12. It is the pulmonary trunk. If I click on it, it's going to zoom in, but that is the pulmonary trunk. Okay, so when that, sorry, I'm zooming in too much. When that right ventricle pumps deoxygenated blood, it's going to have to open up that pulmonary semilunar valve, and it is going to go into this pulmonary trunk. Now notice, if I zoom in here slightly, that pulmonary that pulmonary trunk is going to split because we have two lungs, right? So because we have two lungs, that pulmonary trunk is going to split into a left and a right pulmonary artery. So the right pulmonary artery, which we would have to kind of swivel around here to see, the right pulmonary artery is going to lead towards the right lung, and then the left pulmonary artery is going to lead towards the left lung. So very important to recognize that these are called the pulmonary arteries. Arteries in the human body carry blood away from the heart. So this is one of the rare cases in which these arteries are carrying deoxygenated blood because they're being carried from the heart, from the right ventricle to the lungs to become oxygenated. Also important to notice, we have two pulmonary arteries, okay? So the pulmonary trunk splits into just two pulmonary arteries, a right pulmonary artery and a left pulmonary artery. So great, that blood goes to the lungs, becomes oxygenated, right? Then that blood needs to be returned to the heart, okay? So vessels that return blood to the heart are called veins, okay? So this is a rare instance in the human body that these veins, which are called pulmonary veins, are going to be carrying oxygenated blood because that blood that just became oxygen within the lungs needs to be carried back to the heart. So we can see that we actually have 4 pulmonary veins. We have 2 left pulmonary veins and we have 2 right pulmonary veins, okay? So we can see those pulmonary veins are going to be leading back to this chamber of the heart. I swivel around here, we can see it. The chamber of the heart is called the left atrium. So again, it is an atria, so that means it is a receiving chamber. Okay, so those 4 pulmonary veins carrying oxygenated blood are going to bring that oxygenated blood to the left atrium. Now, from the left atrium, that blood is going to move into the left ventricle, which we know is a pumping chamber. Now notice, just like we saw on the right side of the heart, we can see a valve. This valve that is going to prevent backflow of blood from the left ventricle of the heart back to the left atrium, this valve is called the bicuspid valve. Notice we only see 2 flaps in there. However, something important to note is that the bicuspid valve also has an alternate name. It can also be called the mitral valve. So the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve, those are synonymous terms. So the same structure, just 2 different names. You need to be familiar with both in anatomy because they're often used interchangeably. And just like on the right side of the heart, the bicuspid or the mitral valve, important in preventing backflow of that oxygenated blood from the left ventricle back into the left atrium. All right. So finally, we get to talk about where does that left ventricle pump the blood? Well, it's oxygenated blood. It's reached the left ventricle. Where does it need to go? Well, where does it make sense? Where in our body do we need oxygenated blood? Well, any place in our body where we have living cells, which is our entire body system. So this is where the left ventricle is going to be responsible for pumping blood into what is called the systemic circuit to get that oxygenated blood ultimately into our arterial system, which is going to be a bunch of different arteries, again, arteries meaning carrying blood away, that are going to branch and bring that oxygenated blood to all of our body tissues. So how does it go from that left ventricle into that arterial system? Well, we can see it here. We can see that this left ventricle is going to pump. It's going to be difficult for me to get a really good visual into this chamber, but there is an aortic semilunar valve, which is going to be similar to that pulmonary semilunar valve, which leads into this massive vessel, the biggest artery in our body. Can you name it if you're following along? This is called the aorta. Specifically, this portion of the aorta is called the aortic arch, and we're going to talk about these first 3 branches off the aortic arch in another video. But the aorta is going to be carrying that oxygenated blood that the left ventricle is going to pump, And from the aorta, we will have all of the arterial branches that will ultimately be carrying that oxygenated blood to the body tissues. That gas exchange at the tissue level will occur, and then that deoxygenated blood will have to return through the venous system back to the right side of the heart. So it creates this beautiful circuitry that allows for the heart to act as this pump to allow for the proper delivery of oxygenated blood and return of deoxygenated blood, and then the reoxygenation of blood in the lungs. It is such a beautiful system. So that gives you a general overview to the blood flow through the heart in those different chambers. I'm going to have a lot of other follow-up videos on heart anatomy and physiology. There are a lot of additional anatomical structures to be familiar with the heart, but hopefully this provided you with some insight. As always, never hesitate to reach out with questions. Please like and subscribe. That would mean so much to me if you want to get updated on when I'm releasing new videos. And you can also always contact me via email as well. Happy studying, you guys, and can't wait to see you soon.